January 1945. The mud of Nancy, France, was a frozen slurry of iron and ice, where the air felt like a razor against the skin at -12 degrees Celsius. Within the cramped, blood-stained walls of a field hospital, a white lieutenant made a decision that would either define his career or end it. He stood over an exhausted combat medic, a black soldier who had just spent 48 hours hauling dying men out of the snow, and gave a chilling command. "Get up, boy. A real officer needs that bed. Let the German POW sleep there." But before the medic could even move, the heavy oak doors of the ward swung open with a violence that shook the building. General George S. Patton stepped into the dim light, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting, and his eyes fixed on the lieutenant with a lethal intensity. Patton didn't wait for a salute. He didn't wait for an explanation. He had witnessed a betrayal of the American uniform, and his response was about to bypass every military regulation in the book. Today, we reveal the "no color in the mud" incident, a moment of raw justice that was buried by the Pentagon for 80 years to protect the reputations of the high brass. This is why Patton believed that a medic's hands were more sacred than an officer's rank. To truly understand the explosion of fury that occurred in that hospital ward, one must look deeper into the fractured heart of the United States military in early 1945. The Third Army was a colossal machine, but its gears were often grinded by the friction of Jim Crow laws exported from the American South to the battlefields of Europe. Private Elijah Banks was a man of the 366th Infantry, a unit that had been decimated during the winter fighting, but whose medical detachments were the unsung heroes of the Lorraine campaign. These men worked in what the soldiers called the butcher's gallery, field hospitals where the scent of gangrene and cheap disinfectant was so thick it could be tasted. Banks hadn't seen a real bed in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion, and his hands were stained with the lifeblood of men who, back in the States, wouldn't have been allowed to sit next to him on a bus. The lieutenant, a man named Sterling from a rear echelon quartermaster corps, represented the dark side of this paradox. He was a man who arrived at the front lines with clean boots and an even cleaner sense of racial entitlement. To him, the war was a social hierarchy first and a military struggle second. When he looked at the German SS major, a captured officer of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, he didn't see a monster who had likely ordered the execution of American prisoners weeks earlier. He saw a fellow officer, a man of European gentility, who deserved the comfort of a cot more than a black American medic. This was the toxic delusion that Patton encountered when he stepped out of the shadows. Patton stood in the center of the room, his breath visible in the freezing air, his gaze shifting from the medic on the floor to the German in the bed. The atmosphere in the ward became heavy, the only sound being the rhythmic dripping of melting ice from the ceiling. Patton realized that if he did not act, the ideological rot of the enemy would find a permanent home in his own ranks. He looked at the lieutenant, and his voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to vibrate the very surgical instruments on the tables. "You standing there in that clean uniform, looking at this medic like he's dirt," Patton rasped. "You've spent the war counting boxes of C rations while he's been counting the last breaths of my infantrymen. And you think the enemy is your social peer? You're not just a fool, Sterling. You're a goddamn infection." Patton's methodology for maintaining discipline was never found in the pages of the Field Manual 21-100. He believed that shame was a more powerful tool for correction than a firing squad. He ordered the entire medical staff and the walking wounded to assemble in the ward. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the story to have legs. Patton walked up to the lieutenant, who was now shivering not from the cold, but from the realization that his world was collapsing. With a calculated, brutal efficiency, Patton reached out and personally tore the silver bars from the man's shoulders. The sound of the ripping wool echoed like a gunshot. He then did the same with the officer's division patch. "You aren't fit to wear the symbols of a nation that fights for freedom," Patton growled, his voice carrying the weight of a heavy artillery barrage. Then he turned his attention to the SS officer. The German, sensing the chaos, tried to maintain a facade of dignity. Patton didn't give him the chance. He ordered 2 MPs to haul the German out of the cot by his collar. The SS major was thrown onto the stone floor, his silk-lined tunic becoming stained with the muck of the ward. "That is where the enemies of civilization sleep," Patton barked. Turning back to Sterling, now a man without a rank, Patton issued the sentence that would rewrite the history of that field hospital. "Private Banks," Patton said, addressing the medic with more respect than he had shown any general that day. "This man is now your primary orderly. He will not sleep until you sleep. He will not eat until every wounded man in this facility has been fed. He is to perform every menial, filthy task you require. And if he fails, or if he shows you even a shadow of a sneer, you are to contact my personal aide. I will have him transferred to a replacement pool in the 90th Division as a frontline scout. Let's see how his superiority holds up against a Mauser at 50 yards. This wasn't just a demotion, it was a psychological deconstruction. Patton was forcing a man who believed in racial castes to perform the most humble service for a man he had deemed inferior. It was a masterclass in leadership by inversion. Patton understood that the lieutenant's prejudice was a form of cowardice, a way to feel powerful without ever facing the enemy. By stripping him of his rank and putting him under the command of Private Banks, Patton was offering the man a choice: become a soldier through service or die a coward in the mud. For the rest of the day, the ward watched in stunned silence as a former officer of the United States Army was forced to scrub the blood-stained floors under the quiet, dignified direction of a black medic. Why was George S. Patton, a man raised in the traditions of the post-Civil War South, so adamant about this case? Patton was a military realist. He knew that the Achilles heel of any great army was internal division. He had seen the 761st Tank Battalion in action. He knew that black soldiers were the lifeblood of his logistics through the Red Ball Express. For Patton, racial prejudice was a civilian luxury that had no place in total war. He realized that if his soldiers felt their own officers valued the enemy more than their brothers in arms, the Third Army would lose its lethal edge. The Pentagon, however, was terrified. In 1945, the War Department was under massive pressure from Southern senators to maintain strict segregation. If the story of Patton stripping a white officer to serve a black private had reached the headlines, it would have sparked a political firestorm. Patton's aide-de-camp, Colonel Codman, later noted that this incident was one of many scrubbed from the official logs. It was too raw and too dangerous for the status quo of 1945. Patton wasn't acting as a social reformer. He was acting as a commander who knew that to crush the Nazis, he could not allow Nazi-like prejudices to fester in his own barracks. The lieutenant, once known only as Sterling, served his sentence as a medical orderly for 32 grueling days. He carried stretchers through the frozen Saar mud and scrubbed the blood of dying teenagers off hospital floors until his hands bled. According to the few surviving unofficial diaries from that medical detachment, the man's arrogance didn't just break, it underwent a total chemical transformation. He saw that Private Banks didn't treat him with the malice he had expected. Instead, Banks treated him with the cold, professional detachment of a superior officer who had no time for petty hatreds. By the time the Third Army began its final thunderous push across the Rhine and into the heart of the collapsing Reich, the man was quietly reinstated to his rank and transferred to a different sector. He never spoke of the incident in Nancy again, but his service record for the remainder of the war was described by his peers as humble, tireless, and devoid of the ego that once defined him. Private Elijah Banks survived the carnage of the European theater and returned to an America that, in 1946, still practiced the very systemic prejudice Patton had crushed in that stable. The justice he received from the general was a solitary, brilliant island in a sea of inequality. But for the soldiers of the 761st and the 366th, the story of the general and the medic's bed became a sacred piece of combat folklore. It gave them the psychological strength to keep fighting, knowing that at the very top of the hierarchy, there was a man who saw them not for their race, but for their courage and their sacrifice. Today, we look back at George S. Patton and see a man of immense contradictions, a man who was often profane, difficult to manage, and deeply flawed. But in that one freezing morning in Nancy, he demonstrated the true, raw essence of leadership. He proved that honor is not a gift of birth, and rank is never a shield for bigotry. He taught a lesson that the modern world is still struggling to master, that in the mud of the trenches and the fire of battle, we are all the same color. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive into the hidden history of the Third Army. If you believe that history should be told in its rawest, most honest form, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Join our community and let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Private Banks' position that day? Your engagement helps us bring these buried truths back to light.